On the 18th day of December 1944, just beyond the humble Belgian hamlet of Kringelt, a German anti-tank unit assumed its strategic stance behind their formidable 88mm Park 43. This weapon was a behemoth, exceeding 16 feet in length. Its barrel possessed the capability to propel a 22-pound armor-piercing projectile at a velocity nearing 3,000 feet per second. A biting frost adhered to the cold metal. The soldiers' exhalations manifested as wisps of white vapor. They had been on high alert since 3 o'clock that morning, integral to the vast German offensive that would later be indelibly etched in history as the Battle of the Bulge. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, age 26, commanded the gun. A seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front, he had previously vanquished 11 Soviet tanks during the brutal engagements at Kursk. For Richter and his crew, their 88 represented far more than a mere instrument of war. It was the embodiment of absolute certainty. In 2 years of continuous conflict, Richter had never encountered armor plating that could withstand a direct impact at operational distances. This held true for the Soviet T-34, the British Churchill, and most certainly for the American Sherman, a vehicle the Germans disparagingly referred to as a Tommy Cooker, a rolling coffin. If you are finding this in-depth exploration of historical events engaging, please consider clicking the subscribe button and share your location with us in the comments section, letting us know from where across the globe you are tuning in today. Emerging through the pre-dawn haze, Richter detected movement. Approximately 300 meters down the tree-lined forest road, a Sherman tank materialized from the dense foliage. It was a routine observation. His gunner, Gefreiter Heinz Müller, was already manipulating the traverse wheel, bringing the lengthy barrel to bear on the approaching adversary. The loader swiftly rammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. The entire operation, from detection to readiness, transpired in just 11 seconds. They had executed this sequence countless times, rendering verbal communication redundant. Müller expertly centered the aiming reticle on the Sherman's hull, just beneath the turret ring, precisely where the armor was weakest on American tanks. Richter issued the command. The 88 unleashed a deafening roar, its concussive force rattling all nearby equipment and sending a shockwave of overpressure across the frozen terrain. The projectile traversed the intervening distance in less than a third of a second. It struck, but then it bounced. The crew witnessed the brilliant flash of impact, the shell deflecting upwards at a sharp angle, vanishing into the somber gray sky. For a tense moment, silence pervaded. Müller blinked through his optical sights, convinced he had miscalculated the range or the firing angle, but the telemetry confirmed his accuracy. 300 meters, a near-perpendicular engagement, a textbook shot. The Sherman continued its relentless advance. Richter ordered another round. The loader, his actions now instinctual despite the burgeoning confusion in his mind, was already in motion. The breech clanged shut. Müller fired once more. This time, all eyes were fixed with unwavering concentration on the point of impact. The shell struck the Sherman's glacis plate, dead center. Again, the bright spark. Again, the deflection. The projectile, which should have pierced 4 inches of hardened steel and reduced the occupants to fragments, skipped off the hull as if it were a mere stone on the surface of water. The Sherman's turret began to pivot, rotating towards their concealed position. What Klaus Richter and his crew were unaware of, indeed could not have possibly known, was that they were confronting one of only 254 M4A3E2 assault tanks ever manufactured. The Americans affectionately termed it the Jumbo. Its frontal armor was not the 2 inches of a standard Sherman, nor even the 4 inches found on later iterations. In critical areas, accounting for the angle of engagement and additional applique plating, its protection approached 7 inches of hardened steel. The 88mm Pak 43, the gun that had fundamentally reshaped armored warfare on the Western Front, had just encountered its equal. The paramount question was not whether the German crew would survive the ensuing 30 seconds. The pressing concern was how many additional German gunners would face this seemingly invincible Sherman before the intelligence services would finally heed their unbelievable reports. To comprehend the profound shock of that moment outside Kringelt, one must first grasp the immense significance the 88mm gun held within the German Wehrmacht. It was not merely a weapon, it was a tangible philosophy of warfare, the very steel embodiment of German tactical supremacy that had defined 3 years of armored combat. The Flak 18, the progenitor of the 88, was initially conceived in the early 1930s as an anti-aircraft artillery piece. Its exceptionally high muzzle velocity, necessitated to engage high-flying bombers, endowed it with remarkable penetration capabilities against ground targets. During the Spanish Civil War, crews of the German Condor Legion discovered its efficacy in destroying Republican tanks with relative ease. This crucial lesson was not lost on the strategists of the Wehrmacht. By 1940, the 88 had been significantly adapted for dedicated anti-tank operations. The PaK-43, introduced in 1943, elevated its performance to even greater heights. Its tungsten core ammunition possessed the ability to penetrate 6 inches of armor at a distance of 1,000 meters. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, it could overcome any Allied tank then in service. British Churchills, with their robust infantry support armor, proved vulnerable. Soviet T-34s, lauded for their ingeniously sloped hull design, offered no effective protection, and American Shermans were, by all accounts, veritable death traps. If you are finding this content enjoyable, please remember to subscribe and inform us in the comments from where in the world you are observing this presentation. The statistics were stark and extensively documented. A United States Army study conducted in 1944 revealed that German 88mm guns were responsible for approximately 30% of all Sherman tank losses in Normandy, despite constituting less than 10% of Germany's anti-tank weaponry. The gun's effective engagement range exceeded 2,000 meters, enabling German crews to engage Allied armor long before American 75mm guns could retaliate. The kill-to-loss ratio was devastating. For every 88mm anti-tank gun destroyed, German crews claimed an average of 7 Allied tanks. German crews were intimately familiar with these figures. More importantly, they felt the tangible weight of this superiority. The confidence derived from operating the 88 was absolute. Their rigorous training regimen actively reinforced this perceived dominance. Gunnery instructors impressed upon their students that the sole challenge lay in accurately hitting the target, not in its penetration. Military doctrine operated under the assumption that any Allied tank struck by an 88 was unequivocally destroyed. After-action reports consistently corroborated this assumption, month after month, battle after battle. This psychological certainty extended beyond the individual gun crews themselves. German infantry soldiers understood that the presence of an operational 88 positioned them within a secure zone, rendering Allied armor incapable of advancing. Commanders routinely integrated the gun's formidable capabilities into their defensive strategies, strategically placing them at vital road junctions and along anticipated enemy approach routes. The mere visual confirmation of an 88, even if expertly camouflaged and remaining silent, possessed the power to halt an Allied advance. Tank crews harbored a profound dread of these weapons. Intelligence officers tirelessly sought their locations. Artillery units prioritized their destruction. By the latter months of 1944, as Germany's military situation grew increasingly desperate, the 88 represented one of the few remaining technological advantages the Wehrmacht still possessed. German tank production significantly lagged behind the overwhelming output of the Allied forces. While the Panther and Tiger tanks were undeniably formidable machines, they were also complex and notoriously prone to mechanical failures. However, the 88, whether mounted on a tank destroyer chassis or employed as a towed anti-tank piece, remained exceptionally reliable, devastatingly effective, and psychologically dominant. American tankers grimly referred to them as murder guns. British crews spoke of them as widowmakers. Soviet reports characterized positions defended by 88s as death zones. The gun had justly earned these grim appellations through 3 years of unwavering performance. It had accounted for more Allied armor destruction than any other German weapon system. And in December of 1944, as the Wehrmacht initiated its final desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the 88 crews advanced with the unshakable confidence of men who had never known defeat. That confidence was on the precipice of shattering. While German gunners operated with supreme self-assurance, American tank crews entered combat in 1944, burdened by a profoundly different psychological outlook. As they clambered into their M4 Sherman tanks, they did so with the statistical certainty of being outmatched. The Sherman was not primarily engineered to confront heavily armored German vehicles. Its core design prioritized mass production capabilities that German industry simply could not replicate. This was a sound strategic tenet, but it offered scant comfort to the men confined within those steel compartments. The frontal armor of the most common Sherman variant measured a mere 2 inches on the hull and 3 inches on the turret. Later models, such as the M4A1 equipped with the 76mm gun, increased this to approximately 4 inches on the glacis plate, taking into account its 47-degree slope. These specifications were deemed adequate against the majority of German tanks and all German anti-tank guns prevalent in 1942 and early 1943. However, by late 1944, they were perilously obsolete. A German 88mm PaK-43 possessed the ability to penetrate 4 inches of armor at a distance of 1,500 meters. The Sherman's frontal protection could be compromised at ranges where American gunners were unable to effectively return fire. The German Panther tank, armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from the front at a distance of 1,000 meters, while remaining virtually impervious to the Sherman's own armament at the same range. The Tiger, with its formidable 88mm K-36 gun, presented an even more extreme disparity in capabilities. If you are enjoying this extensive look into historical events, please consider subscribing and letting us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching today. American tactical doctrine acknowledged this grim reality with unvarnished honesty. Training manuals explicitly instructed Sherman crews to avoid frontal engagements with German heavy armor whenever circumstances permitted. The preferred maneuver was to leverage numerical superiority, execute flanking movements, and assault from the sides or rear, where German armor was considerably thinner. Official doctrine suggested that it required an average of 5 Shermans to reliably neutralize a single Panther. Crews, in their dark humor, reduced this grim calculus to a macabre jest: 4 Shermans to draw the Panther's attention, and 1 to maneuver into a position behind it. The unfortunate nickname Ronson, or Tommy Cooker, stemmed from the Sherman's notorious tendency to erupt in flames when penetrated. Early production models stored ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides, directly in the path of incoming projectiles. A direct hit often ignited the propellant charges, resulting in catastrophic internal conflagrations. Crews had approximately 30 seconds to evacuate before internal temperatures reached lethal levels. Many tragically did not survive. Later variants relocated ammunition storage beneath the turret basket and incorporated water jackets for fire suppression, yet the tank's dangerous reputation persisted. Casualty statistics served as a grim testament to these fears. A 1944 study conducted by the 3rd Armored Division indicated that 62% of tank crew casualties occurred within the initial 30 days of combat. New crews, lacking familiarity with proper tactical deployment, suffered disproportionately. However, even seasoned crews faced daunting odds. The average operational lifespan of a Sherman in intense combat was measured in weeks, and sometimes even mere days. Crews were rotated through replacement tanks with disturbing frequency. Despite these realities, Shermans continued to pour onto the battlefield. American industrial capacity yielded nearly 50,000 M4 variants throughout the war. German factories, in contrast, managed to produce approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers during the same period. The Sherman's mechanical reliability, its straightforward maintenance requirements, and its logistical simplicity enabled American armored formations to sustain sustained operations indefinitely. German heavy tanks, while superior in firepower and protection, spent considerably more time awaiting spare parts than actively engaging the enemy. This dynamic created a fundamental paradox within American armored doctrine. Strategically, the Sherman was a war-winning asset due to its sheer numbers and sustained operational capability. Tactically, however, individual crews confronted terrifying odds with every encounter involving German heavy weaponry. The tankers who fought in Normandy, who advanced through the hedgerows and engaged Panthers at point-blank range, understood that their survival hinged not on their armor, but on speed, effective concealment, and the fervent hope that the next German projectile would miss its mark. Into this challenging battlefield environment, in the summer of 1944, arrived 254 tanks that shattered every preconceived notion about American armor. They bore the Sherman's name and silhouette, yet their armor protection rivaled that of German heavy tanks. Their official designation was the M4A3E2. The crews affectionately referred to them as Jumbos, and for reasons intrinsically linked to secrecy, limited production runs, and urgent deployment, German intelligence failed to acknowledge their existence until it was far too late. The M4A3E2 assault tank emerged not from deliberate long-term strategic planning, but from a critical necessity recognized in the spring of 1944. As Allied planners meticulously prepared for the invasion of Normandy, intelligence assessments painted a deeply concerning picture. German forces had extensively fortified the French coastline with formidable defensive works, including concrete bunkers, heavily reinforced strongpoints, and layered anti-tank obstacles. The arduous task of breaching these formidable defenses would necessitate armor capable of spearheading infantry assaults while withstanding punishment that would have easily destroyed standard tanks. This pressing issue ultimately reached the desk of Major General Gladden Barnes, the chief of the Army Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service. His proposed solution was elegantly straightforward. Take the proven Sherman chassis and augment it with as much armor as the suspension system could physically accommodate without compromising operational integrity. This involved no radical redesigns, no extensive testing periods, simply the addition of substantial quantities of steel welded onto existing hulls. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was awarded the contract in May of 1944. Engineers calculated that the M4A3 chassis, powered by its Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, could support an additional 9 tons of armor without succumbing to catastrophic mechanical failure. The base hull armor was effectively doubled. The glacis plate received an additional 1.5 inches of face-hardened steel, bringing the total thickness to approximately 5.5 inches at a 47-degree angle. This configuration created an effective armor thickness of roughly 7 inches against direct fire. The turret underwent even more significant enhancements. The frontal casting was increased to a solid 7 inches of steel. The mantlet, designed to protect the gun mount, measured nearly 8 inches at its thickest point. Side armor was augmented from 1.5 inches to 3 inches. Even the tank's tracks received protective skirts, intended to shield the suspension from the devastating effects of hollow charge weaponry. The vehicle's overall weight escalated from 33 tons to 42 tons. Its top speed decreased from 30 miles per hour to approximately 22. The power-to-weight ratio, already a marginal concern on standard Shermans, dropped to a mere 14 horsepower per ton. This rendered the Jumbo sluggish in acceleration and challenged its ability to ascend steep inclines. However, none of these performance compromises truly mattered if the armor proved effective. Production commenced in June of 1944 and concluded by July. The limited run of 254 tanks reflected both the project's urgency and the inherent limitations of the approach. Each Jumbo required approximately 12 tons of additional steel at a time when every pound of armor plate was meticulously allocated to competing strategic priorities. The decision was made to produce a small contingent of specialized assault tanks rather than to marginally enhance a larger fleet. The initial 75mm M3 gun was retained, a decision that would later prove a source of considerable controversy. Ordnance officers argued that the Jumbo's primary role was to absorb enemy fire and facilitate breaches, not to engage enemy armor at extended ranges. The shorter, lower-velocity 75mm gun offered superior high-explosive performance, which was advantageous for bunker busting. However, this meant that Jumbo crews possessed extraordinary defensive capabilities while being armed with a gun that was fundamentally inadequate for engaging the heavily armored German tanks they were likely to encounter. The first Jumbos arrived in Europe in late July of 1944, several weeks after the initial Normandy landings. They were distributed in small numbers across various armored divisions rather than concentrated into dedicated units. The 2nd Armored Division received 30 jumbos. The 3rd Armored Division received 34. The 4th Armored Division, which would later lead Patton's drive across France, received 22. This strategic dispersal meant that the vast majority of American tankers never actually encountered a jumbo. Likewise, most German intelligence officers never had the opportunity to capture one intact. Crucially, no formal doctrine or established procedures existed for the effective employment of the jumbo. Company commanders were issued tanks possessing armor specifications that seemed almost fantastical, yet they received no specific training on how best to exploit these formidable advantages. Some commanders utilized jumbos as spearheads for urban assaults. Others positioned them as mobile fortifications in defensive lines. A few enterprising commanders placed them at the very front of column advances, trusting the tank's robust armor to absorb the initial enemy ambush and effectively reveal enemy positions. The crews themselves were composed of standard Sherman tank personnel, not specially selected or uniquely trained. They learned their tank's capabilities through a process of trial and error, often under the intense pressure of combat. The significant weight difference was immediately apparent. The jumbo accelerated slowly, struggled in muddy terrain, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. However, in direct engagements, the armor performed far beyond expectations. Crews reported hits from German anti-tank guns that would have easily destroyed standard Shermans, but on the jumbo's hull, these impacts merely left superficial dents and scorch marks. Word of these remarkable survivability statistics spread informally through the ranks. Certain Sherman tanks, despite their identical silhouette to standard models, were reportedly nearly impervious to frontal attack. However, this crucial information remained anecdotal, confined primarily within American formations. German intelligence, already overwhelmed by the rapid collapse of French defenses and the immense task of tracking hundreds of Allied units, never identified the jumbo as a distinct variant requiring a dedicated tactical reevaluation. The failure of German intelligence to identify the Jumbo Sherman represents one of the war's most consequential oversights. It was not a consequence of incompetence, but rather the natural outcome of a military intelligence apparatus that had been systematically degraded by 3 years of continuous losses, relentless strategic overextension, and the cumulative impact of successful Allied counterintelligence operations. By late 1944, Germany's military intelligence, known as the Fremde Heere West, or Foreign Armies West, operated under conditions of profound operational blindness. The Abwehr, Germany's primary military intelligence service, had been significantly compromised by Allied double agents and subsequently absorbed into the SS earlier that year. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, which were essential for gathering tactical intelligence on Allied troop movements, had been systematically swept from the skies by the overwhelming superiority of Allied air power. The Luftwaffe was struggling to defend German cities, let alone conduct systematic reconnaissance of Allied rear areas where new equipment would likely first appear. Human intelligence networks within both England and France had been meticulously dismantled. The remarkable success of Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan for the D-Day landings, starkly demonstrated just how thoroughly German intelligence had been penetrated and manipulated. Officers who had once confidently assessed Allied capabilities were now forced to operate on mere fragments of information, unsubstantiated rumors, and outdated intelligence. They were aware that the Americans were producing tanks in vast quantities and that the British were introducing new variants with improved weaponry, but the precise details and specifications necessary for tactical adaptation remained frustratingly elusive. The Jumbo's deliberately limited production numbers also inadvertently aided in maintaining secrecy. 254 tanks represented less than half of 1% of the total Sherman production. Dispersed across multiple divisions on a front stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, they appeared with such rarity that initial sightings were often dismissed as anomalies or misidentifications. A German anti-tank crew reporting that an 88mm shell had inexplicably bounced off a Sherman was far more likely to be accused of having missed the target than to be believed to have encountered a novel armored variant. Moreover, the Jumbo's external appearance bore a striking resemblance to standard Shermans. Unlike the visually distinct heavy tanks such as the British Churchill or the Soviet IS-2, the Jumbo retained the familiar Sherman silhouette. At combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, often obscured by smoke, vegetation, or poor weather conditions, German gunners had mere seconds to identify their targets. The very training that had served them so effectively for 3 years, the ingrained assumption that a Sherman equaled thin armor and an easy kill, now proved to be their undoing. The few jumbos that were ultimately destroyed and subsequently examined provided misleading intelligence. If a jumbo was incapacitated by a projectile hitting its side or rear, where the armor remained comparatively thin, examiners would simply note standard Sherman construction characteristics. If a jumbo was disabled due to mechanical failure or abandoned by its crew, the withdrawing personnel prioritized the retrieval of vital equipment such as weapons, optics, and radio apparatus over the meticulous measurement of armor thickness. The incremental nature of the armor upgrades meant that field measurements might reveal variations without adequately conveying the systematic and substantial enhancements that had been implemented. German tactical doctrine inadvertently compounded the problem. By late 1944, Wehrmacht defensive strategies increasingly emphasized mobility, ambush tactics, and strategic withdrawal over static defensive positions. Anti-tank guns were typically positioned to engage enemy flanks and rears, rather than to engage in direct frontal duels. When a jumbo did appear and successfully withstand frontal impacts, German crews were often inclined to assume they had misjudged the angle or range of their shot, rather than fundamentally questioning their long-held assumptions about American armor capabilities. The conspicuous absence of captured German documents regarding this specific variant proved critically significant. Allied security classifications ensured that jumbo specifications were maintained under the tightest possible control. Unlike typical Shermans, for which technical guides had been seized throughout 1943 and 1944, no specialized jumbo manual ever fell into German possession. American crews had been instructed to obliterate any documentation if surrender appeared imminent. The infrequent instances where jumbos were lost in an intact condition were typically reclaimed by American forces before German intelligence units could conduct comprehensive assessments. Perhaps most critically, the timing of the jumbo's introduction coincided with Germany's overarching strategic unraveling. During the summer and autumn of 1944, German military forces were reeling from devastating losses incurred during Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, the disintegration of Army Group Center, the unsuccessful encirclement at Falaise Pocket in France, and the loss of Romania's vital oil reserves. Intelligence assets were concentrated on identifying existential threats to Germany, such as Soviet advances, Allied airborne operations, and the anticipated invasion across the Rhine. A modestly more protected Sherman variant, appearing in small quantities on a front where hundreds of Allied tanks were operational, simply did not register as a pressing concern. Intelligence summaries from September through November of 1944 contain no mention of reinforced Sherman armor. Tactical bulletins cautioned about improved Allied anti-tank weaponry and air supremacy, but continued to evaluate American tanks as susceptible to German anti-tank artillery at standard combat distances. This intelligence deficiency spawned a potent psychological weapon. When German crews encountered jumbos and witnessed their projectiles ricochet, they experienced not merely tactical surprise, but profound cognitive dissonance. The 88mm gun, the very weapon that had never failed them, suddenly appeared unreliable. Crews began to doubt their own proficiency. Had they used the incorrect ammunition? Was the cannon defective? The alternative, that American armor had achieved parity with Germany's heavy tanks, seemed inconceivable. By the time German intelligence began receiving consistent reports of heavily armored Shermans in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had commenced. Amidst the pandemonium of Germany's final offensive, with entire divisions cut off and communications fragmented, systematic intelligence gathering became unfeasible. Individual units adapted as best they could, but no army-wide tactical directive was issued to counter the jumbo threat. The chasm between reality and German expectations would persist until the war's conclusion. The full psychological impact of the Jumbo Sherman became starkly evident during the initial days of the Battle of the Bulge, when German tactical assumptions collided with American armor that refused to adhere to expected behaviors. The skirmish near Krinkelt was not an isolated event. Across the Ardennes front, from Monschau in the north to Echtenhout in the south, 88mm crews confronted a bewildering new reality. On the morning of December 17, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division encountered jumbos from Company B, 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, in the vicinity of the Belgian village of Buchenbach. The German contingent included 5 Tiger tanks and multiple PaK-43 anti-tank guns strategically positioned to ambush American reinforcements advancing towards the breakthrough sector. The terrain favored the defenders, with open fields offering minimal concealment, compelling Allied armor to proceed along predictable pathways. 3 jumbos spearheaded the American column. Standard tactical procedure would have been suicidal. The Tigers and anti-tank guns possessed clear firing lanes exceeding 1,000 meters, but the jumbo commanders, having learned the capabilities of their tanks through prior engagements, advanced with assurance. The German guns opened fire at 800 meters. The first Tiger's 88mm projectile struck the lead jumbo's glacis plate at a shallow angle. The shell penetrated the outer applique layer but failed to breach the underlying armor. The impact sent a concussive wave through the crew compartment, temporarily dazing the driver, but the tank continued its advance. The Tiger crew, perplexed by their target's survival, fired again. The second round impacted the turret front. Once more, no penetration occurred. The jumbo's gunner, now focusing on the Tiger's muzzle flash, returned fire. While the 75mm round was insufficient for frontal penetration of a Tiger's armor, it nonetheless struck the German tank's gun mantlet with enough force to incapacitate the traverse mechanism. Effectively neutralized, the Tiger withdrew. The remaining German armor, witnessing a Sherman absorb multiple 88mm impacts and continue its combat effectiveness, hesitated. That hesitation cost them the initiative. The engagement deteriorated into a chaotic close-quarters battle as American infantry and additional Shermans, encompassing both standard and jumbo variants, pushed into the German positions. By midday, the German force had retreated, having destroyed 2 standard Shermans, but failing to halt the armored column. The 3 jumbos that led the assault bore numerous impact marks on their hulls and turrets. Not a single one had been penetrated from the front. A comparable scenario unfolded across the Bulge salient near Bastogne. A solitary jumbo from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion held a critical crossroads against repeated German assaults. On December 20th, the tank commanded by Staff Sergeant William McVeigh withstood 17 anti-tank rounds over a 6-hour period. German forces, convinced they were confronting a fortified position rather than a mobile tank, eventually circumvented the location rather than continue to expend ammunition fruitlessly. The psychological repercussions rippled through German formations. After-action reports from the 6th Panzer Army, obtained from captured documents, revealed growing bewilderment regarding American armor capabilities. One report from late December stated, "Enemy tank variants observed with improved frontal protection. 88mm penetration unreliable at ranges below 500 meters. Recommend targeting tracks and flanks exclusively." The wording is significant. German tactical doctrine had never characterized 88mm penetration as unreliable. The weapon's effectiveness had been presumed, not questioned. The recommendation to target tracks and flanks represented a fundamental alteration in tactical thinking, an admission that frontal engagement was no longer a guaranteed success. For American crews, the jumbo provided more than just physical protection. It offered psychological liberation. Tankers, who had spent months accepting that their survival was largely a matter of chance and skillful maneuvering, suddenly possessed armor capable of standing and fighting. This newfound confidence translated into tactical aggression. Jumbos were pushed forward into positions where standard Shermans would have been withdrawn. They served as vital rallying points for infantry, provided mobile cover for advancing troops, and acted as psychological deterrents whose mere presence altered German tactical calculations. Nevertheless, the jumbo's inherent limitations remained stark. Its side armor, although enhanced to 3 inches, remained vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical engagement distances. The rear armor, at 1.5 inches, could be penetrated by even lighter anti-tank armaments. Its reduced mobility rendered the Jumbo susceptible to flanking maneuvers and made extraction difficult if the terrain became unfavorable. Furthermore, its 75mm main armament meant the Jumbo could not reliably engage German heavy armor frontally. A Jumbo facing a Tiger or Panther in open terrain possessed armor superiority but a firepower deficit. The engagement became a test of nerve. Could the Jumbo close the distance to point-blank range, where its 75 could exploit weaknesses in German armor? Or would the superior German gun eventually land a side or turret shot that nullified the Jumbo's protection? The outcome depended on the terrain, the crew's skill, and often sheer luck. However, the very fact that such encounters became tactical puzzles rather than certain American defeats signified a revolutionary shift. For 3 years, American armor doctrine had accepted inferiority in direct tank-versus-tank combat. The Jumbo, in its limited numbers and with significant compromises, challenged that fundamental assumption. It was not enough to alter the war's ultimate outcome, but it was sufficient to change how tankers fought and how German gunners aimed. The Jumbo Sherman's combat record through the winter of 1944 and into 1945 demonstrated both its remarkable strengths and its inherent vulnerabilities. As the Battle of the Bulge wound down in late January, American armored divisions compiled after-action reports attempting to quantify what their crews had experienced viscerally. The Jumbo could endure, but mere survival did not guarantee victory. Casualty statistics told a striking narrative. Standard M4 Shermans engaged in heavy combat during the Bulge suffered loss rates approaching 40% in some battalions. Jumbos operating under identical conditions and frequently leading the same assaults experienced loss rates below 15%. This disparity was almost entirely attributable to frontal armor protection. When Jumbos were incapacitated, post-battle analyses consistently indicated impacts to the sides, rear, or catastrophic mechanical failures rather than frontal penetration. However, these figures masked a more intricate tactical reality. The Jumbo's constrained firepower meant it could not decisively engage German heavy armor. In engagements where Jumbos faced Panthers or Tigers, the typical outcome was a stalemate or a withdrawal rather than an American triumph. The Jumbo could survive the encounter, enabling its crew to live and fight another day, but it could not destroy the German tank that had failed to destroy it. This limitation spurred urgent field modifications. Beginning in January of 1945, some Jumbos were equipped with 76mm guns salvaged from destroyed standard Shermans. This conversion was unofficial, undertaken by maintenance units utilizing whatever resources they could improvise. The longer, higher-velocity 76mm gun provided Jumbos a fighting chance against German heavy armor at ranges where their superior frontal protection could be leveraged. Approximately 40 to 50 Jumbos received this upgrade, though precise numbers remain uncertain due to the informal nature of these modifications. Crews lauded the results. A Jumbo armed with a 76mm gun could engage Panthers on a nearly equal footing, possessing comparable armor protection and adequate firepower. Against Tigers, the matchup remained challenging, but no longer hopeless. These hybrid Jumbos represented what American armor doctrine had urgently required since Normandy, a tank that could both withstand and destroy in direct combat with German heavy vehicles. Yet, even as these modifications progressed, the strategic landscape was shifting. By February of 1945, German resistance in the West was disintegrating. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had depleted Germany's final mobile reserves. Fuel shortages immobilized even undamaged German tanks. Allied air superiority meant that German armor could barely maneuver during daylight hours. The tactical problem that the Jumbo had been designed to address, breaking through prepared German defenses, was being resolved instead by overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. The Jumbo's psychological impact, however, persisted beyond its immediate tactical utility. German gunners who had encountered the heavily armored Shermans carried that experience into subsequent engagements. The absolute confidence that had characterized 88mm crews earlier in the war was replaced by caution and uncertainty. Intelligence briefings in February and March of 1945 finally acknowledged the existence of heavily armored Sherman variants, but by then, the warnings arrived too late to meaningfully influence German tactical doctrine. For American tankers, the existence of the Jumbo provided something more valuable than its limited production numbers might suggest: proof that American industry could produce armor on par with German standards when necessary. The narrative that American tanks were inherently inferior, that crews had to accept vulnerability as the cost of mobility and reliability, was definitively shattered. Subsequent American tank designs, including the M26 Pershing heavy tank, which arrived in limited numbers in early 1945, incorporated lessons learned from the Jumbo program. The Jumbo also influenced post-war armor doctrine. The inherent tension between protection, firepower, and mobility, which the Jumbo embodied, became central to American tank design philosophy. The recognition that crews required sufficient protection to survive the initial moments of engagement, even at the expense of speed or range, shaped the development of the M46, M47, and ultimately the M48 Patton tanks, which dominated American armored forces throughout the 1950s. But perhaps the Jumbo's most significant legacy was symbolic. It represented American industrial adaptability, the capacity to identify a challenge, devise a solution, and deploy it in sufficient quantities to make a difference, all within months rather than years. The fact that only 254 were manufactured might seem insignificant against the total Sherman production exceeding 49,000. However, those 254 tanks appeared precisely when they were needed, performed precisely as required, and survived at rates that saved hundreds of American lives. The crews who fought in Jumbos carried their experiences into peacetime. Veteran accounts consistently highlighted the confidence derived from knowing their armor could protect them, the aggression it enabled, and the profound gratitude they felt toward the engineers and workers who had constructed their tanks. For men who had previously accepted that survival was largely a matter of chance, the Jumbo offered something invaluable: control over their own destinies, the ability to stand and fight rather than merely hoping to avoid being hit. The German military's response to the Jumbo Sherman, or more accurately, their inability to respond effectively, illuminated the broader collapse of German tactical and industrial capacity in the war's final months. The intelligence failure that left 88mm crews unaware of enhanced American armor was symptomatic of a military organization that had lost its capacity to adapt to rapidly evolving battlefield conditions. Captured German documents from early 1945 reveal an institution in denial. Training materials for anti-tank crews, even those produced in February and March, continued to list standard Sherman armor specifications. Gunnery tables provided no data for engaging heavily armored variants. Tactical directives presumed that 88mm guns retained their dominant position against all Allied armor. The institutional knowledge base, meticulously built over 3 years of successful employment, could not rapidly assimilate the new reality. Individual German units that encountered Jumbos adapted through hard-won experience. After-action reports from formations that fought in the Ardennes or along the Rhine demonstrate evolving tactics, an increased emphasis on flanking shots, coordinated efforts between multiple anti-tank weapons to strike simultaneously from different angles, and a preference for ambush positions that facilitated close-range engagement of side armor. However, these lessons remained localized, disseminated informally between units rather than through official doctrine. The inability to respond at the industrial level proved even more detrimental. German tank designers were aware, through intelligence reports and interrogations of captured American crews, that upgraded Sherman variants existed. But by late 1944, German industry had lost its capacity for responsive innovation. Factories were subjected to constant aerial bombardment. Raw materials were scarce. The labor force consisted increasingly of slave laborers with minimal technical expertise and no incentive to maintain quality standards. Plans to enhance the penetrating power of German anti-tank guns were in development, including the PK-44, an even more potent 88mm variant, and advanced ammunition types such as sophisticated armor-piercing composite rigid rounds, promising improved performance against thick armor. However, none of these advancements reached frontline units in significant quantities. The factories that should have been producing them lay in ruins. The rail networks that should have been distributing them were paralyzed by Allied air interdiction. This industrial paralysis meant that German anti-tank crews in March and April of 1945 were fighting with essentially the same armaments and ammunition they had employed in 1943. The 88mm gun, which had dominated battlefields for 3 years, was now, in specific circumstances and against specific targets, inadequate for Wehrmacht troops who had relied on technological superiority to offset their numerical disadvantage. This represented a psychological catastrophe. German veteran accounts from the war's final months frequently recount encounters with American tanks that could not be destroyed from the front. The language used is significant. Rather than identifying a specific tank variant, veterans described a generalized phenomenon, a breakdown in the reliable correlation between hitting and killing that had characterized earlier combat. This suggests that even crews who encountered jumbos never fully comprehended what they were facing, viewing it instead as random misfortune or equipment malfunction, rather than a systematic American capability. The psychological impact extended beyond anti-tank crews. German infantry, whose resolve to hold defensive positions often hinged on the confidence that supporting 88mm guns could neutralize Allied armor, began to waver when that assumption proved unreliable. If American tanks could withstand hits from the formidable guns, if they could advance despite concentrated anti-tank fire, then defensive positions transformed into traps rather than fortresses. This erosion of confidence contributed to the Wehrmacht's rapid disintegration in the West during March and April of 1945. Units that might have fought tenaciously in 1943 or 1944, secure in their weaponry and tactics, instead opted for withdrawal or surrender. The Jumbo's role in this collapse was indirect yet measurable. It was not the armor itself that shattered German resistance, but rather the dawning realization that even Germany's most dependable weapon system could falter. Post-war German military analyses, conducted by former Wehrmacht officers collaborating with American military historians, acknowledged the Jumbo as a significant tactical surprise. Reports noted that the failure to identify and adapt to enhanced American armor represented a broader failure of German military intelligence and industrial responsiveness. The recognition that 254 tanks could generate disproportionate psychological effects through surprise and localized superiority influenced Cold War-era discussions on military deception and the paramount importance of technological surprise. For the 88mm crews specifically, men like Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, who survived the war, the memory of rounds bouncing off Sherman hulls remained vivid for decades. In interviews conducted in the 1960s and 70s, veterans consistently described the shock and disbelief of witnessing their most reliable weapon fail. Some questioned whether they had been issued defective ammunition. Others speculated that their guns had been sabotaged. The alternative, that American industry had quietly fielded superior armor in sufficient quantities to make a difference, challenged their understanding of the war they had fought. The Jumbo thus became woven into the broader narrative of German military decline, a symbol of how tactical excellence and superior equipment could be undermined by industrial capacity, strategic surprise, and the cumulative effects of prolonged warfare. It was not a decisive weapon that altered the war's outcome, but it was a telling one, revealing the extent to which German advantages had eroded and how completely American industrial and tactical adaptation had bridged gaps that once seemed insurmountable. The story of the Jumbo Sherman concludes not with statistics or tactical analysis, but with the men who crewed them and the men who faced them. The 254 tanks produced between June and July of 1944 carried approximately 1,270 American tankers into combat. The majority survived the war, a survival rate dramatically higher than that of their counterparts in standard Shermans. This simple fact represents lives preserved, families spared grief, and futures that continued beyond 1945. Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, who steadfastly defended a vital intersection near Baston for 6 continuous hours, while his M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank absorbed 17 enemy impacts, returned to his home state of Pennsylvania following the cessation of hostilities. He subsequently embarked on a 37-year career as a skilled machinist, successfully raised 4 children, and generally maintained a reserved demeanor regarding his wartime experiences. When he did elect to share his recollections, primarily during interviews conducted in the 1980s, his narrative invariably focused not on acts of bravery, but on the overwhelming sense of relief and profound gratitude he harbored for the enhanced armor that shielded him when any semblance of safety had appeared utterly unattainable. His remarkable story, while a singular instance, resonated with hundreds of other crew members. Jumbo crews returned from the theater of operations bearing a distinct psychological weight that differentiated them from their fellow armored vehicle operators. Their survival was not attributed to mere serendipity or evasive maneuvers, but rather to the formidable combination of superior engineering and robust steel construction. The pervasive guilt that afflicted many returning combat veterans was somewhat mitigated by the concrete knowledge that their personal safety had been a tangible outcome of deliberate design. Their ability to endure was a testament to American industrial might rather than the capricious nature of chance. This crucial, albeit subtle distinction significantly influenced how Jumbo veterans processed their harrowing wartime memories. German tank crews who encountered these formidable Jumbos and survived carried their own indelible impressions. The sheer shock of witnessing enemy projectiles harmlessly deflect from their armor. The profound disquiet of a moment when established military doctrine and rigorous training proved utterly insufficient, a trauma that lingered. Some, like former Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, spent years grappling with self-doubt, questioning their own proficiency, and wondering if they had somehow failed during that fateful engagement outside Kringelt. It was only decades later, after historians unearthed the specific design characteristics of the Jumbo and revealed its limited production figures, that these veterans understood their weaponry had not faltered due to manufacturing defects or personal incompetence, but had simply been confronted with armor that exceeded their armament's penetration capabilities. This revelation introduced its own complex emotional landscape. A sense of relief that they had not individually failed was intertwined with a bitter resentment stemming from an intelligence deficiency that had left them unprepared. The stark recognition that American industry could fabricate such formidable tanks in sufficient quantities to exert a meaningful impact, especially as German factories struggled to maintain production of existing models, further reinforced the narrative of impending defeat that many German veterans carried into peacetime. The Jumbo's position within the tapestry of historical remembrance evolved considerably over time. In the immediate post-war period, its significance was largely eclipsed by the introduction of the more advanced M26 Pershing and the broader historical focus on the overall development of American armored forces. Military histories published during the 1950s offered little mention of the Jumbo, prioritizing instead the mass-produced, ubiquitous Sherman and the dramatic, albeit limited, deployments of the Pershing. The Jumbo appeared to be relegated to a mere footnote, an interesting variant that arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the course of events. This perspective began to shift during the 1970s and 80s as historians gained access to previously unavailable German archives and conducted extensive interviews with veterans from both sides of the conflict. The cumulative weight of numerous accounts detailing Jumbos, surviving impacts that should have proven fatal, the tactical adjustments their presence necessitated, and the significant psychological effect they exerted prompted a reevaluation. The Jumbo began to be recognized as a compelling case study, demonstrating how even a small contingent of superior materiel, when deployed judiciously and benefiting from an element of surprise, could achieve outcomes disproportionate to their numerical strength. Contemporary armor historians now regard the Jumbo as a transitional design, effectively bridging the gap between the mass production medium tank philosophy that underpinned American doctrine through 1944 and the heavy tank doctrine that would later emerge during the Cold War era. Its inherent compromises, trading off mobility for enhanced protection while retaining comparatively insufficient offensive firepower, vividly illustrated the inherent difficulties in achieving a harmonious balance among the three fundamental tenets of tank design. Nevertheless, its success in fulfilling its intended operational role, absorbing enemy fire and spearheading assaults, served as a powerful validation for the concept of specialized variants built upon a common chassis architecture. The Jumbo also stands as a potent reminder that technological surprise, even on a modest scale, can indeed yield significant strategic repercussions. 254 of these specialized tanks could not single-handedly alter the ultimate outcome of the war, but they possessed the capability to reshape the unfolding of individual battles, influence the combat techniques of crews, and ultimately increase the number of soldiers who returned home. Within the complex calculus of warfare, where the fate of individual lives often becomes subsumed by statistical aggregates, the Jumbo represents something profoundly important: a recognition that prioritizing the protection of soldiers, even at the expense of other performance characteristics, constituted a worthwhile industrial investment. The final combat engagement involving a jumbo tank occurred in the latter part of April in 1945, as American forces advanced into the southern regions of Germany. A solitary jumbo, belonging to the 4th Armored Division, its hull bearing the scars of dozens of impact marks accumulated over 9 months of intense combat, took the lead of a column entering the town of Regensburg. The German resistance encountered was notably light. The war was slated to conclude within the subsequent 2 weeks. The crew, exhibiting signs of profound exhaustion and emotional desensitization, parked their formidable tank in the town's central square and awaited further directives that never arrived. The war simply ceased around them. This particular jumbo emerged from the conflict unscathed. It was eventually transported back to the United States, utilized for a brief period in training exercises, and subsequently dismantled for scrap in the 1950s as American armored doctrine transitioned towards newer vehicle designs. Today, no complete original jumbo tank exists in any museum, though a few modified examples have survived. The tanks that absorbed punishment intended to be lethal, that preserved lives through their steel and engineering, were ultimately cut apart and melted down. Their metal was recycled into products for peacetime consumption. However, the enduring memory persists within the first-hand accounts of the veterans who crewed them and those who faced them in battle. It is preserved in the after-action reports meticulously documenting their improbable survivability, and in the photographic evidence that displays the silhouettes of Sherman tanks marred by impact craters that should have signified destruction. The Jumbo Sherman was not the tank that single-handedly won the war, but it unequivocally demonstrated that American armor possessed the capacity to withstand and engage the enemy effectively, that protection was an achievable goal, and that a concentrated industrial effort, swiftly applied to pressing challenges, could indeed save lives, even in the war's final, desperate months. Back outside Krinkel on that frigid December morning in 1944, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter observed the impossible: the turret of an American Sherman traversing towards his position. His crew was already initiating preparations to reposition, to relocate, and attempt a renewed engagement from a different vantage point. The formidable 88mm gun, which had consistently served them well, had just failed them twice. The established doctrine that had guided them reliably for 3 years had been shattered in a mere 30 seconds. While the war would persist for another 5 months, in that specific moment, their certainty had evaporated. They had encountered something novel, something for which their training had offered no preparation, something that German intelligence had never forewarned them about. They had confronted 7 inches of American steel, and they learned far too late that the era of the 88's unassailable dominance was drawing to a close. The Jumbo had performed precisely as it was engineered to do. It had survived, and in its act of survival, it had unveiled a new truth about the conflict: that American industry, when singularly focused and operating with urgency, was capable of producing armor that rivaled Germany's finest. While not in overwhelming numbers, and not deployed soon enough to alter the war's ultimate conclusion, it was sufficient to make a significant difference for the men who climbed into those tanks and ultimately returned home alive.